I'm Dr. Alexander Jacob, and the topic of my talk today is William Joyce, whom you probably remember as Lord Haw-Haw, who broadcast propaganda for the German Reich during the last Great War. William Joyce was born in 1906 in New York to Irish-English parents who had become naturalized Americans in 1892. When William was 3 years old, his parents returned to Britain and to County Mayo in Ireland. Joyce's father, Michael Joyce, was a Protestant sympathizer with the Union and a member of the Royal Irish Constabulary. In 1921, when the Anglo-Irish Treaty created an Irish Free State, Michael and his family felt too vulnerable to attacks from the Sinn Féiners for his loyalist activities and consequently moved to England. In England, William revealed his proclivity for military activity by enlisting in the Worcester Barracks, even though he was only 16 and below the required age for military service. However, he was sent home in 4 months. He then turned his thoughts to acquiring an education and enrolled in the Battersea Polytechnic in London. He later worked towards a bachelor's degree at Birkbeck College in the University of London. During his undergraduate days, he joined the Officer Training Corps of the university and served as the president of the Conservative Society. It was in 1923 that Joyce joined the British Fascisti movement, which was obviously inspired by the Italian Fascisti founded by Mussolini in 1919 as a response to the growing threat of Bolshevism. The Fascisti acted as a paramilitary organization in support of the Conservatives against the Labour Party. In October 1924, Joyce headed a group of Fascisti who guarded the electoral meeting of Jack Lazarus, the Conservative-supported candidate for Lambeth North. In a scuffle that ensued with the Communists and Jews, Joyce was cut in the face so that he henceforth bore a long scar on his right cheek. He left the Fascisti in 1925 and became a member of the Conservative Party, which he considered as a champion of Anglo-Saxon tradition and supremacy. Unfortunately, the domination of the party by complacent and avaricious men who had betrayed the nation to the agents of international finance reduced the prospects of advancement in the party for such a radical conservative as Joyce, and he left the Conservatives too in 1931, just before the formation of the sterile national government of that year. When Oswald Mosley emerged on the political scene with the founding of the British Union of Fascists in 1932, Joyce welcomed him as a saviour of Britain. Mosley had begun as a Conservative member and then went over to the Labour Party, in which he served some important posts, including the Chancellorship of the Duchy of Lancaster under Ramsay MacDonald. When he realized that the Labour Party was incapable of dealing with the problem of mass unemployment, he founded his own party with its own magazine, Action. Joyce was valuable to Mosley in his capacity as a powerful public speaker, and in 1934 he was made the director of propaganda of the movement. It should be noted that Mosley's fascism was not anti-Semitic to start with, since the general manager of his magazine was a Jew called Hamlin. Unlike Mosley, however, Joyce was fully anti-Semitic in his attitude and declared at one of his meetings, "I don't regard the Jews as a class. I regard them as a privileged misfortune." But Mosley was too dependent on big business for support to be overtly anti-Semitic. In April 1934, for instance, he declared at a large public meeting that he was not anti-Jewish nor even anti-democratic, and that he would first have recourse to constitutional means in order to be in a position to replace the parliamentary system by a corporate state. However, Joyce's forceful presence in the movement, as well as the increased violence from the left against the British Union of Fascists, caused Moseley to sharpen the anti-Semitic focus of his party. Moseley even appointed Joyce the deputy leader of the Union. Still, the rift between the basically moderate Moseley and the radical Joyce grew in the next 2 years, and Joyce soon realized that the British Union of Fascists was doomed by its compromising attitude, even though the movement changed its name to the British Union of Fascists and National Socialists in 1936. In March 1937, Joyce himself stood as a candidate in the elections for Shoreditch, at which he lost. Moseley was forced to reduce the number of his staff at this time and decided to dismiss Joyce as well. Joyce attempted to form his own British National Socialist League, but there was very little support for his cause, which aimed at destroying parliamentary democracy in favour of a fascist syndicalist state and at allying Britain to Germany and Italy against the Bolshevist Soviet Union. So in 1938, Joyce finally decided that National Socialism had a better chance of survival in Hitler's Germany than in England. And when the Emergency Powers Act came into force in 1939, in view of the likelihood of a war between England and Germany, Joyce and his second wife Margaret left London for Berlin. He justified to himself his decision to leave England for a nation which would soon be at war with his country in the following words: "England was going to war. I felt that, if for perfect reasons of conscience I could not fight for her, I must give her up forever. In small matters, it is easy enough to be guided by conventional loyalty. In great matters, a man has the right to hold himself responsible to higher justice alone." Within a week of the Joyces' arrival in Berlin, Germany attacked Poland, and the Second World War had begun. Fearful at first of being considered a hostile alien in Germany, Joyce attempted to return to England. But since this meant travelling to the British consulate in Cologne, he decided to stay on in Berlin, despite the uncertainties ahead. Joyce worked for a short period as a translator for the German Foreign Office, and later found employment as an announcer in the Foreign Service of the Reichsrundfunk under the Ministry of Propaganda, headed by Dr. Joseph Goebbels. When Joyce began his propaganda work for the Reich, he found that he was not the first to do so, since Norman Bailey Stewart, an officer of the Seaforth Highlanders, had already before the war renounced his British citizenship and broadcast for the National Socialists throughout the Reich. The appellation Lord Haw Haw, which was bestowed on Joyce, was probably misdirected, since the Daily Express, which was the source of this nickname, was more likely referring to Bailey Stewart's voice than to Joyce's, when it declared, "He speaks English of the Haw Haw, damn it, get out of the way variety, and his strong suit is gentlemanly indignation." By Christmas 1939, Joyce decided to apply for German citizenship, though he had been broadcasting for Germany before he acquired this, that is, while he was technically still a British citizen. And it was, according to British law, treason for a British citizen to take up the nationality of an enemy nation during war. However, German citizenship was indeed granted to Joyce in September 1940. Joyce's broadcasts were marked by an effort to highlight the terrible danger of the whole of Europe, including England, falling into Bolshevist hands if Germany did not attempt to stop the enemy in time. Also, like most war propaganda of the time, whether Allied or German, Joyce's reports tended to exaggerate the military mistakes of the enemy and the successes of his own side. However, while Joyce may have been proved wrong in his predictions of a victory for the Axis powers, his analysis of the causes of the war were never less than accurate. As he said, "Those of the British people who are not blind now realize that the pretext for this war was far removed from the cause of it, namely the subservience of the so-called democratic politicians to their Jewish masters." In January 1940, Joyce wrote his well-known political booklet, Twilight over England, which contained an incisive denunciation of the steady capitalistic decay of England since the end of the 17th century. The book had been commissioned by the German Foreign Office for a fee of 10,000 marks, and was used as propaganda material for foreign prisoners of war in Germany. It was translated into German and also into Swedish. With the impending defeat of the Germans at the hands of the Allies, the propaganda office was moved from Berlin to Oldenburg. Quickly after this move, the Joyces were forced to move through Denmark to Sweden. When it was discovered in Denmark that a passage to Sweden would be too difficult in the chaotic traffic of fleeing refugees that prevailed at the end of the war, Joyce decided, unfortunately, to return to Flensburg in Germany, whereas if he had stayed in Denmark, he would have received rather lenient treatment from the authorities there. It did not take long before he was discovered by some British officers, including the Jewish Lieutenant Parry, who shot at Joyce when the latter reached into his pocket for his passport. Joyce was wounded in the thigh and was taken back to England as a traitor. His tense court trial revolved on the issue of his nationality, for, although he possessed a British passport during his first travel to Germany, he was born in America and could be considered an American citizen, which fact would have protected him from a British trial. But since there was no doubt that Joyce claimed to be a Briton when applying for his British passport, and was in fact proud of doing so, and since, moreover, the public, stirred to outrage by the Jewish press, wanted to see a sacrifice after the damages of the war, defending Joyce proved to be an exercise in futility. He was found guilty of treason for his broadcasts in Germany in 1939, when he was still an English passport holder, and his appeal to the House of Lords was dismissed without a statement of reasons, which reasons the Lords declared would be announced at a later date, that is precisely after the date set for Joyce's hanging, the 3rd of January 1946. Thus William Joyce died a martyr in the cause of European nationalism at the hands of his own countrymen, who had been seduced by alien Jewish financial interests into betraying their native cultural disposition and tradition, as well as whatever was valuable in their world empire, and forced into a devastating world war which would inevitably bring about the end of Britain as a major cultural and political force. Joyce's life and work receive, in retrospect, the prophetic power of a British Cassandra, and all serious students of modern history and culture must find in his Twilight over England one of the most important explanations of the curious fall of the British Empire soon after the fall of its rival, the German Third Reich. The chief importance of Joyce's work lies in its penetrating analysis of the corruption at the centre of the British Empire in the Victorian age, when England was led by its most imperialistic Prime Minister, the Jew, Benjamin Disraeli. The basic problem with the empire and the seed of its ruin was the transference of power to the financial agencies of the Jewish bankers in England, without regard to the preconditions of political viability of any imperialistic structure, which can survive only if it is economically sound in itself, and if the individual components of it are equally in a position to survive economically and socially. The transfer of power to the city or banking centre of London began in the 17th century, after the disastrous civil war between the Royalists following King Charles I and the Puritan Roundheads headed by Oliver Cromwell. The Puritans were heavily supported by the banking community and the affluent Jewish bankers of Amsterdam. The Puritan devotion to the Old Testament made their acceptance of Jewish help effortless, despite the fact that the Jews had been driven out of England in 1290 under Edward I. Besides, as the sociologist Werner Sombart has shown in his important book Die Juden und das Wirtschaftsleben, the Protestant ethic of industriousness was directly linked to the sanctification of commercial profit-making among the Jews. On acquiring political power in the country, Cromwell allowed the Jews to return to England, unaware of the tremendous consequences that his unthinking action would have for the future of his nation. The first parliament set up by the Puritans was so politically inept that Cromwell himself paid only token respect to the concept of popular representation and ruled as a demagogue instead. The arrival of the Jews in England led quickly to the grant of a concession to Ali ben Israel, which was to result during the reign of William of Orange in the establishment of an independent Bank of England in 1694 as a private money-lending agency to the government. Meanwhile, already by 1679, there had appeared in England two parties, the Tories and the Whigs, the former remnants of the Cavaliers, and the latter those of the Roundheads. The Whigs were the party destined to dominate English politics in the 18th century, since they had the powerful backing of finance, whereas the Tories were largely a land-based aristocracy. The scientific revolution of the late 17th century also meant the gradual shift of attention away from agricultural concerns to industrial and allied commercial ones. Migrations from the country to the city increased, and while the landed gentry and agriculturists diminished in importance, the mercantile classes gained steadily, as illustrated most strikingly in the enfranchisement of the lesser merchants in the Reform Act of 1832. The Tory and Whig parties were transformed in the Conservative and Liberal parties respectively, but Disraeli's manoeuvring of the Conservative Party into the fold of high finance in the 19th century exposes the steady liberalization of both parties. Thus, at the turn of the century, Joseph Chamberlain, the Liberal Prime Minister, had no difficulty in buying up the entire Conservative Party, so that, as Joyce put it, from that time onwards, the Conservative Party was only a more respectable, a more delicate, in fact, a nicer medium for the expression of acquisitive commercialism. The economic consequences of the rise of liberalism in England meant the adoption of a disastrous policy of importing cheap foodstuffs from abroad to the detriment of the home agriculture. These cheap foodstuffs were needed especially to keep wages low in the rising industrial centres of the land. While the Tory ideal was denounced as reactionary, liberal democracy proceeded in its essential task of commercial exploitation under the protection of slogans such as those flaunted in the French Revolution about liberty, equality and fraternity. The increasing materialistic outlook of English politics received a pseudo-philosophical sanction in the Manchester School of Economics, though, as Joyce pointed out, its principles could be reduced to the formula buy in the cheapest markets and sell in the dearest. Another principle of this school of economics was free trade. Both these principles are indeed typical of the financial strategies of the leading financial house in England, the Rothschilds, who had acquired fabulous riches from speculations related to the financing of the Battle of Waterloo against Napoleon, who himself had been extremely suspicious of the illegal international commercial machinations of the Rothschilds in Europe and had sought to curb them. The increasing domination of British politics by the Rothschilds is one of the most tragic aspects of Western history. The search for unending lucre throughout the world meant the encouragement of the empire at all costs, so that cheap raw materials, as well as cheap labour for industries, could be found. The latter focus on cheap labour, however, meant the simultaneous economic deprivation of home labour forces and the demoralization of labour forces in the colonial territories, where impoverished masses were recruited for heavy labour at slave wages. As Joyce perceptively adds, in fact, the mentality of England was developing in such a direction as to enable the Jews to prepare for the blessed day when Britain would be one of their colonies. The increasing economic depression of the working classes made them a willing prey to the new doctrines of the Jew Karl Marx, who pretended to support the enslaved workers while clinging to the same materialistic view of society espoused by the exploiting classes directed by the Jewish financiers. The result was the artificial creation of class wars and the opposition of socialistic internationalism to the apparent nationalism of the imperialistic financiers. The latter, however, could scarcely have been disturbed by the internationalism of the new movement, since nothing served their business interests better. Their so-called nationalism was nothing but imperialistic jingoism, since they had no genuinely nationalistic desire to develop the home industries or to strike a balance between agriculture and industry. When the conservative nationalism became synonymous with capitalism and liberalism, the Liberal Party itself moved inexorably to its final form as socialism. The Liberal Party was soon transformed into a more radical party called the Labour Party. Using the so-called conservatives' capitalistic nationalism as an excuse, the Labour Party became increasingly anti-nationalistic in its propagation of social reforms. not to mention that the Labour Party, as well as the Conservative, was financed in large part by Jews such as Bernard Barron, the proprietor of the Carreras Tobacco Company. The all-consuming interest in trade that had become the trademark of parliamentary democracy in England now manifested itself in the most blatant contradictions as far as the parties were concerned. As Winston Churchill himself nonchalantly rationalized it in his book Thoughts and Adventures, published in 1932, yet parties are subject to changes and inconsistencies not less glaring than those of individuals. How should it be otherwise in the fierce whirl of parliamentary conflict and electoral fortune? But anyhow, where is consistency today? The greatest Conservative majority any modern parliament has seen is led by the creator of the Socialist Party, and dutifully cheers the very statesman who a few years ago was one of the leaders of a general strike, which he only last year tried to make again legal. A lifelong free trader at the Board of Trade has framed and passed amid the loudest plaudits a wholehearted protectionist tariff. The government, which only yesterday took office to keep the pound from falling, is now supported for its exertions to keep it from rising. In all of these giddy fluctuations of parliamentary fortune and complexion, the people are not in the least consulted regarding their opinion on major national issues. Thus, as Joyce points out, on not one single issue of importance have the people been consulted for a generation. Nobody asked them whether they wanted the Great War. Nobody put before them the real facts of the treaties of Versailles and asked for their opinion. Nobody asked them whether England should return to the gold standard. They were never given a chance to consider the issues involved in the general strike. The decision to attack Germany was arbitrarily taken by a handful of men who were responsible only to the city of London and its Jewish leading houses. No act of despotism could be more complete. And so, Joyce concludes, the system of government in Britain today deserves one description only. It is a plutocratic oligarchy, materialist in philosophy, Jewish in purpose, and tyrannous in effect. The increasing subservience of the state to business was consolidated by the spurious economic theories of thinkers like John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, who prescribed for the state a mere supervisory role so that business could flourish in an unrestricted manner. The precarious nature of free trade was demonstrated most acutely in the period preceding the First World War, when other European nations decided to stop depending on British imports and become self-sufficient to such a degree that they might engage in competition with the reigning champion of world trade. Germany, in particular, after its formation of a Reich in 1871, was a threat to the economic foundations of the British Empire. However, the British Empire was eventually destroyed by its topsy-turvy focus on external territories rather than on the home country itself. Britain's agriculture had steadily waned from the middle of the 19th century. Heavy business investments abroad increased the importation of cheap foodstuffs into Britain, since countries that obtained British money often found themselves unable to repay their financial commitments, except through the export of food. Thus, home agriculture suffered without remission. Joyce gives the example of Scottish fishermen who have had enormous quantities of their fish flung back into the sea in order that a rise in prices may be secured. This, in spite of the fact that millions of British people were undernourished. Heavy industries were also on the decline, especially coal, which suffered from foreign competition and the increased use of machinery. Furthermore, Britain's huge investments in fuel oil made it imperative that she sustain the import of oil, even at the expense of the local coal, which might have been developed more economically as fuel. Needless to add, more than 100 international oil companies were at that time owned by the Jews, Whaley Cohn and Bierstedt. Ironically, Germany at the same time was proving to the world that synthetic production of oil from coal was a successful proposition. The cotton industry obviously suffered from the policy of equipping India and Japan with cotton factories, which would employ cheap labor. Under the direction of the Jews Schuster and Sassoon, India was made to impose a duty of 25% on the import of English cotton manufactures, and soon Lancashire underwent a tremendous economic slump, and the industrial centre of Liverpool turned into a ghost town. These were the results of a tyrannical plutocracy which masqueraded as a democracy, and saw fit to denounce Hitler's regime as a cruel dictatorship in order to turn the British public's attention away from the victimization that they themselves suffered at the hands of their financial and political leaders. The means whereby the financial middlemen reap disproportionate profits at the expense of those involved in production and manufacture are restricting supplies and causing shortage. As Joyce put it, it was only when the blessings of modern democracy made their appearance 150 years ago that the worker was told in an arbitrary manner that his efforts must be slackened and regulated henceforth by the private interests of an infinitesimal proportion of the world's population. In Germany, on the other hand, the authoritarian state had decreed that economics should be directed to the maximal production of the commodities required by the population. For this, the control of the currency wherewith the people can purchase these commodities must be fully in the hands of the state, just as all other economic elements such as prices, wages, rents, dividends, and profits. This dissociation of Germany from the fraudulent network of Jewish international finance was in the final analysis the main cause of the declaration of war against her by Judaized Britain. We may remember that Waley Cohen, the British oil magnate, was also the Zionist vice president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, who personally funded the powerful British anti-Nazi council called the Focus. The Judaization of Britain is one of the most sorry facts of Western culture, since, as Joyce points out, the Jew used his wealth to permeate into every stratum of society, carrying with him his racial consciousness, his racial character, his racial purpose, and his monstrous materialism. The English aristocracy has become so demoralized that it even permits intermarriage with Jews, who, as Joyce says, have no more interest in developing estates than in bacon curing. Indeed, the failure to segregate the Jews from the native population will inevitably lead to the debasement of the standards of culture and the land of their sojourn. The social ascendancy that the Jews enjoyed in the 19th century was mainly due to the financial power of the Rothschilds, who after the Battle of Waterloo made their country estates at Tring a second seat of British government. The price of gold is fixed daily at the Rothschild offices, and they control the lending operations of the city through manipulation of stock deposits and loans. In these nefarious activities, they are helped by their international familial contacts, and the same pattern of international commercial ramifications is evident in the case of other Jews, such as the Schieffs, the Warburgs, the Sassoons, the Cassells, and the Guggenheimers. With such formidable organization, it is little wonder that all major commercial activities are dominated by the Jews, including the clothing industry, department stores, the chemical industry, led by Lord Melkett's Imperial Chemical Industries, the petroleum industry, led by Lord Beerstead and Waley Cohen, and above all the press and film. The Nuremberg laws of 1935 and the annexations of Austria and Czechoslovakia also meant the influx of hundreds of thousands of Jews from Central Europe into England. As regards the empire, Joyce maintains that he does see some value in the concept of a genuine imperialism, but not in that of the grasping commercial network that the British Empire had become under its Jewish financiers. As he put it, the pertinent charge, however, against the British politicians is not that they are grasping imperialists, but that they have no conception of imperialism at all. The basic defect of the British Empire is that it is democratically directed in an extensive rather than an intensive way. The lands annexed to the British Empire have not been developed economically in themselves, so that there is starvation in India, for example, and unemployment in Britain itself. The only motivating force of the empire in its present form is the financial greed of the Jewish merchants and politicians who have little interest in developing the natural resources of other lands or even of Britain herself. The Boer War is a case in point, since it was fought so that the Jews of South Africa may speculate in gold and diamonds at the expense of the agriculturists. This is typical of the international financiers, who, as Joyce points out, would far sooner risk his money in the hope of high profits than invest it for a relatively low return in the development of lands where hard and patient work is needed before any considerable profit can be reaped. The extreme poverty and backwardness of many of the British colonies was totally ignored by the British leaders when they self-righteously criticized Germany for its alleged oppression of Czechs and Poles. As Joyce put it, Germany is not seeking a vast expanse of territory over which international financiers can play their game of speculation with diamonds and gold, whilst real wealth lies untapped and scorned. Every inch of ground that Germany has at home and abroad, each single inch is and will be consecrated to the purpose of enabling ordinary people to live a fuller, happier, and more prosperous existence. A real empire would seek to achieve autarky within the constituent states. On the other hand, the almost inscrutable stimuli which agitate the British Empire keep it in sickly being. And, as he put it, it was largely because England refused to treat her dominions and colonies any better than foreign nations that she lost their confidence. Even as early as the 18th century, the attempt to treat colonies as a mere source of profits was in large measure responsible for the American Revolution. At the same time, the Jewish leaders have seen to it that democratic ideas are sown vigorously in the colonial lands, so that the simple peoples there are misled into thinking that a parliamentary system in their own country would solve all their present problems, unaware of the continuing ties to the international financial network that this system implies. Since the Jewish financiers are confident that through a democratization of a former colony they can still retain their financial hold on the new country, they are little concerned to preserve the British Empire if the latter shows signs of disintegration, as it did in the early part of this century. Thus, as Joyce points out, when the Scottish nationalists talk quite worthily of the national aspirations of the Scots, they usually omit to say what they propose to do with the Royal Bank of Scotland, which has so many associations with international finance. The Jewish financial leaders indeed even foster nationalism to divert attention from the need of economic revolution. In India, where there has been no indigenous tradition of democratic government throughout its long history, many British leaders sought to encourage democratic struggles, even though autocratic rule is the most natural for the Indian peoples and lands. Jewish financial and political leaders, like Montagu and Lord Reading, thus favoured a policy of independence, not because they cared for Indian nationalism, but because they preferred to lose the empire for Britain rather than lose colonies like India altogether for their international financial network. Besides, the Jewish Democrats sought to retain the presence of the British Army in India, apparently to prevent communal battles between the Indians themselves, but in reality to ensure the protection of capitalist interests. As Joyce perceptively points out, the Indian nationalist is apt to blame England for everything. If he would only look behind the facade which the word England represents, he would see that he and the English themselves are the victims of the same evil force. The case of Palestine is even more tragic, since Britain's former protection of the Arabs was completely abrogated by the pressure of Britain's Jewish financial community in favour of the creation by force of an artificial Jewish state from Arab land. Chaim Weizmann's influence over Anthony Balfour was so great that genuine Englishmen like T.E. Lawrence had to look on helplessly as the Jews moved in to occupy the Arab lands and inflict all manner of violence on the natives. Their lack of any interest in the British themselves, except as a means of furthering their own ambitions, is demonstrated by the fact that arrogant Jewish radicals even shot British soldiers in the Palestine for showing the least support to the Arabs. In the case of Germany, her fate after the First World War was to become a protectorate of the British-American Jewish Empire. The rulers of high finance had already brought about the fall of the old monarchies of Europe in the course of the First World War, and the empire of the world was transferred to the counting houses. As Joyce put it, all that they needed in the way of statecraft could be supplied by babbling democratic assemblies, which threw up the facade of popular representation in order that the financiers might operate behind it. To them, discipline and order seemed loathsome things, as loathsome as a well-ordered condition of the body would be to some noxious germ. The Kaiser and his Prussian monarchy were overthrown, and the people punished with starvation and deprivation, while the Jewish usurers sucked the last profits from the throbbing carcass. Then it established its own alien social democrat government on the state, and in order to facilitate the participation of the German economy in the international Jewish one, Germany was urged to join the League of Nations. At this time appeared Hitler and the National Socialist Revolution. The emergence of authoritative leaders in Italy and Germany who were more concerned with the welfare of their own people than the profits of the financiers was a deadly threat to the latter. One of the first moves made by Hitler was to dissociate his country from the international financial network as well as the League of Nations. Mussolini's success in economic affairs provided an impetus to the adoption of a similar totalitarian economic order in Germany, which would assure the welfare of all the population regardless of their class. Joyce proceeds to detail the social and economic benefits to the masses of a fascist state. The organic nature of the new Germany, he says, does not permit the existence of floating masses of poor and unemployed outside the structure of society. Every single worker knows and feels his relationship to the state as a whole. He knows his rights as well as his duties. He knows that he cannot get out of the state what he fails to put into the state, but he also knows that what he does put in, he will get back in full measure. With the abolition of class differences, the state has been able to administer an equitable distribution of property, and the need of envying private property on principle, as the communists do, has disappeared. The unemployment figure in Germany dropped dramatically, and production began to rise. Significantly, the Jews were driven out in large numbers as being the main obstacle to a national regeneration. Those who emigrated, however, added to the chorus of opposition to the Reich in the various countries in which they now settled. In foreign policy, Hitler was determined to nullify the cruel Versailles dictates and recover the Tsar in a peaceful manner. Austria was first annexed, since the majority of Austrians favoured union with their German cousins. In Czechoslovakia, the Germans were tyrannized by the Czech Jewish leader Beneš, so that Hitler took the glaring opportunity to conquer the Sudetenland. Similarly with Poland and its German population, which Hitler saved with the assistance of a temporary ally, the Soviet Union, which obtained much of the Baltic states in return for its non-aggression pact with Germany. The Jewish press in England at once turned up its propaganda machine to a burning belligerence, and Britain declared war immediately, following the German invasion of Poland. War was an inevitable result also of the other major ploy of the Jewish financiers at that time, namely the creation of a financial crisis more disturbing than that of 1931. They began to drain out their gold resources from London to the USA, and the pound began to drop in value to such a degree that only a war could save the economy. However, as Joyce tells us, the real purpose of the British war effort was made clear by the report in the Daily Express on July the 21st, 1939, that since Britain is the last refuge and strength of the Jews, the greatest service we can do to the Jewish race is to make this country an impregnable stronghold against aggression. The initial effect of the war on the British population was disastrous, since prices and taxes rose and confusion reigned supreme with the collapse of the educational system. The war minister, the Jew Hore Belisha, was forced to resign, but there soon appeared on the scene as Prime Minister the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, who, as Joyce points out, was the descendant of the Duke of Marlborough and great-grandson of a plantation mulatto. Churchill represented the old democratic system at its worst, since he was, as Joyce puts it, the first honorary Jew in the world. Unfortunately for him and for his nation, he did not fully realize that the jingoism called to life during the first months of the war was to be used only to sustain the Jewish financial interests, and that if Britain won the war, all nationalism in England would be effectively curtailed by the Jewish leaders, since, as Joyce declares, the supreme fact of world politics today is that the Jews want no nationalism but their very own. The prophetic accuracy of the statement is only too well borne out today by the present state of Britain, and indeed of every other state of Europe and the Western world. The ruin of the British Empire, engineered by Roosevelt and his Jewish allies on both sides of the Atlantic, may seem to have given America a temporary advantage, but certainly not to the Americans themselves, but rather to their Jewish financial masters. While the fall of the British Empire can scarcely be regretted, since it had quite early on in its history fallen a willing prey to the corrupting influence of Jewish finance, the total fall of the National Socialist Reich, however, may be considered a serious loss to Europe, and by extension the world, for it had sought to repudiate the blatant materialism of the Western democracies by appealing to what Carlyle called the inner genial life of men. As Joyce expressed it, the cardinal philosophical principle of National Socialism is the belief, as the guiding principle of life, in the transcendental ability of the human non-material will to overcome all material obstacles and to make environment the slave of human personality. He points to the fact that the German worker under the new regime is most unlike the abject proletarian type under communism, or his avaricious counterpart under capitalist democracy, since he is an honored and integral part of the state. The state, indeed, as he puts it, provides him with all that the earth can yield, but the greatest emphasis is ever on the spiritual truth that survival is an act not of digestion, but of will. Thus, whilst assured of all that his land's resources can offer, he is prepared to sacrifice all that his children may advance one stage further along the road of civilization. This emphasis on the spiritual culture of the individual and of the nation is what distinguishes National Socialism from the Jewish-inspired and ruled systems which seek at present to control the world. Fortunately, in spite of the setbacks that Germany and Europe have suffered after the so-called victory of the Allies at the end of the Second World War, the idealism of Carlyle and Joyce have not died, because in the nature of things it cannot die. The organic life of the Europeans will, despite all efforts to suppress it, find in its own spirit the vital strength to combat and throw off the Jewish infection that has penetrated deep into the national body of the European and Western peoples. And in the meantime, one may indeed derive more than a passing comfort from Joyce's witty remark that, if the good God had meant the world to die in these years, he would have entrusted its extermination to some force more in keeping with his nobility than the Jewish race.
Germany calling, Germany calling, Germany calling. Here are the Reich and ambush, Station Bremen and Station DXB on the 31-meter band.
This evening I am talking to you about Germany. That is a concept that many of you may have failed to understand. Let me tell you that in Germany there still remains the spirit of unity and the spirit of strength. Let me tell you that here we have a united people who are modest in their wishes. They are not imperialists. They don't want to take what doesn't belong to them. All they want is to live their own simple lives, undisturbed by outside influences. That is the Germany that we know. I can remember when I cast my memory back to 1932 and 1931, I can remember how everything that could be done to stimulate the hatred of England against Germany was done. I remember how my own friend said, "What shall we do with this man Hitler? He wants Poland. He wants Czechoslovakia. What shall we do if he wants more than that?" Now, it does behoove you to think at the moment how much Stalin has taken and how much Stalin wishes. I ask you to remember that in 1939, in August, the only question was that of bringing Danzig back to the Reich. No more and no less. What a small problem that was in comparison with those that confront us today. Surely, if only we had had the common sense to agree that the German people of Danzig should go back to the Reich, then we might have had peace. We might have avoided all the terrible sacrifices of the last 5.5 years. We might have avoided the hatreds, which can only be very gradually repaired. Now I say to you, my English listeners, the trouble is this. Germany, if you like, is not anymore the chief factor in Europe. Germany may be, I may be wrong, I will only say that the German arms have been in many battlefields defeated. But I ask you, how could it ever be possible for England to maintain a front against Soviet Russia unless she had the help of the German legions? That is a question which may perhaps be debated and discussed ad infinitum. I cannot promise that I can give any solution to it tonight. I can only say that if Germany and England together had decided to preserve the welfare of this continent, then I should have hope. Then I should be happy, an optimist. But so far as I can see, the policy of England has been to allow Germany to sacrifice her very last, the ultimate end of her resources, in an attempt to stay the Bolshevik attack. If I am right, then I can only say that the people of Britain deserve what they get in the future. I speak now personally. I want to talk to you of what I know and what I feel. I have always hoped and believed that in the last resort there would be an alliance, a combine, an understanding between England and Germany. Well, at the moment, that seems impossible. Good. If it cannot be, then I can only say that the whole of my work has been in vain. I can only say that I have day in and day out called the attention of the British people to the menace from the east which confronted them. And if they will not hear, if they are determined not to hear, then I can only say that the fate which overcomes them in the end will be the fate that they have merited. More I cannot say. A tremendous, world-shattering conflict is because the people of Germany have in them the secret of life, endurance, will, and purpose. And therefore I say to you, in these last words, you may not hear from me again for a few months. I say Es lebe Deutschland, and farewell.